I had been on the road for hours, driving down a 2-lane highway that cut through a vast, empty landscape. It was the kind of place where you could drive for miles without seeing another car, just an endless stretch of cracked asphalt and dry, yellow fields. The sky had started turning a dull gray as the sun sank lower, and I knew I had to find a place to stop for the night. I wasn't in a rush to get anywhere, just moving. No real destination, just the need to keep going. I had left everything behind a while ago. My old job, my old town, everything that felt like it had been weighing me down. I had some cash, my truck, and a beat-up old tent in the back. That was enough. There were no motels out here, no gas stations, not even any houses. Just the occasional dirt road leading off into the distance, vanishing behind a line of trees or disappearing over a hill. I had no phone signal either, not that it mattered much. I had an old map folded up in the glove box, and I could navigate well enough without GPS. Eventually, I spotted a narrow gravel road breaking off from the highway, marked by a weathered wooden sign with faded lettering. It wasn't the kind of road that led anywhere important, just another forgotten path leading deeper into nowhere. But it was getting dark, and I didn't want to sleep on the side of the highway. I turned onto the road and followed it into the trees. The deeper I went, the rougher the road became. Potholes, loose rocks, and patches of mud made the ride bumpy, and my tires kicked up a cloud of dust behind me. I kept driving for what felt like another 10 or 15 minutes, watching as the trees grew thicker on either side. The road twisted and narrowed until I finally found a small clearing. It was flat, quiet, and far enough from the main road that I wouldn't be bothered. I killed the engine, letting the silence settle around me. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches creaking. I got out of the truck, stretching my legs, and took a deep breath. The air smelled like damp earth and pine, the way forests always do at night. I grabbed my tent from the back and started setting up. It wasn't much, just a simple one-person tent I'd used a dozen times before. As I hammered the stakes into the ground, I noticed how quiet it was. No traffic noise, no distant hum of civilization, just the occasional rustling in the underbrush, the faint chirp of insects. Once the tent was up, I built a small fire. I hadn't seen any fire restriction signs, and I figured a little warmth wouldn't hurt. The flames flickered weakly at first, then caught, casting long shadows through the trees. I sat down beside it, opened a can of beans, and ate straight from the tin. I didn't think about much, just stared into the fire, listening to the occasional snap of a branch in the woods. Probably just a deer or a raccoon moving through the brush. That was normal, but after a while I started to get this feeling. Not fear exactly, just unease. It wasn't any one thing, just a sense that the woods around me were too still, that the rustling I heard earlier had stopped completely. Even the wind had died down. I looked up from the fire, scanning the darkness beyond the trees. Couldn't see much, just shadows and the faint outline of tree trunks stretching into the night. Then I heard it, a sound, a crunch, like a footstep on dead leaves. I stayed still, listening. My first thought was that it was just an animal. Coyote, maybe, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The step was too deliberate, too slow. I reached for the hatchet I kept near my tent. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Another step, closer this time. I stood up, scanning the tree line. My fire didn't cast enough light to see far, just enough to illuminate the first few feet of forest. Beyond that, it was pitch black. I strained my ears, waiting. Then nothing. Silence. No more steps. No movement. Just the crackling of my fire and my own heartbeat pounding in my chest. I stayed like that for a while, gripping the hatchet tight. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been nothing. Maybe an animal that got spooked when I stood up. Maybe my imagination playing tricks on me. I sat back down, kept the hatchet close. The night dragged on. I barely slept. Every little sound made me tense up. The wind picked up again, rustling the branches, and I told myself it was just the trees, just the forest settling in for the night. By morning, I felt stupid. Nothing had happened, just my nerves getting the best of me. I packed up my gear, stomped out the fire, and got ready to leave. But as I walked around to the back of my truck, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Not mine. They were spaced out like someone had been walking slowly. Deliberately, they led from the edge of the clearing to a spot near my tent, then stopped. No return tracks, no signs of movement beyond that point. I stared at them for a long time, my brain struggling to make sense of it. Then, without thinking, I turned and looked at the tree line. Nothing, just trees. I didn't waste time after that. I threw my gear into the truck, slammed the door shut, and backed out of the clearing as fast as I could without getting stuck. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway again, the open road stretching out in front of me. Even now, I don't know what I was dealing with out there. I don't know who or what was watching me. All I know is that I'm never going back. I wasn't even supposed to be on that road. It was an old 2-lane highway cutting through the middle of nowhere, stretching for miles between patches of forest, open fields, and stretches of land that looked like no one had stepped foot on them in years. The kind of place where, if something happened to you, no one would know for a long time. I was driving back home after visiting a friend in a town a few hours away. It was late afternoon when I left, the sky already darkening with heavy clouds. The forecast had warned of storms, but I didn't think much of it. The road was empty, nothing but the occasional truck passing by. I wasn't familiar with the area, but I had my GPS, and as long as I followed it, I figured I'd be fine. Somewhere along the way, I realized I was low on gas. The last town I passed through had a station, but I hadn't thought to stop. I checked my phone, no signal. Great. I kept going, figuring I'd hit another town soon. Then it happened. The engine sputtered. The gas light had been on for a while, but I'd been hoping I could stretch it. I pushed the pedal, but the car gave out completely, rolling to a slow stop on the side of the road. I turned the key. Nothing. Just the dead sound of an empty tank. I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel. Outside, the wind had picked up. The air felt heavy, thick with the coming storm. I looked down the road in both directions. Nothing. No buildings, no signs, just that long stretch of highway disappearing into the trees. I took a deep breath and got out. The silence was unsettling, just the distant rustling of trees. I checked my phone again, still no signal. I popped the trunk and grabbed my backpack. I had some bottled water, a flashlight, and a jacket. I figured my best option was to walk. I hadn't seen a gas station in a while, but if I stayed on the road, I had to reach something eventually. I locked the car and started walking. The road felt different on foot. The cracks in the pavement, the worn-out road lines, the patches of weeds creeping through. It all seemed more obvious now that I was walking. I kept my pace steady, listening for any cars. But there was nothing. Minutes turned into an hour. The storm was coming in fast, the sky turning a deep gray. The wind pushed against me, carrying the scent of rain and something else. Something stale, like damp earth but sharper. Then I saw something ahead. A small, weathered sign on the side of the road, half covered in rust. Gas 2 miles relief flooded through me. 2 miles wasn't ideal, but it was doable. I kept walking faster now. The trees on either side of the road thickened, their branches bending in the wind. The further I went, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't just the silence, it was something else. I glanced behind me. The road was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I picked up my pace. The gas station came into view, a tiny, rundown building with a single pump out front. The windows were dirty, the sign above the door missing letters. It looked abandoned. I stepped onto the cracked pavement, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. There was no car, no lights, but there was an old payphone near the entrance. I hurried over and lifted the receiver. Dead, of course. I pushed the door to the station open, creaked loudly. The inside was worse than I expected. Shelves half empty, dust covering everything. A faint smell of mildew hung in the air. Behind the counter, a door stood slightly open, leading to a back room. I stepped inside. Then I heard it, a sound from the back, a soft, dragging noise. I froze. My mind raced. Maybe it was an animal, a raccoon or something. I took a slow step back. The noise stopped. I stood there listening. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. I turned toward the door, ready to leave, when I saw it, a figure, outside, standing by the gas pump. They weren't moving, just standing there, facing the building. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of their body. Something about the way they stood, rigid and still, sent ice through my veins. Then slowly they moved, not toward me, just shifting, like they were adjusting their stance. I swallowed hard. My heart pounded. I had to leave. I backed up, careful not to make a sound. When I reached the door, I pushed it open as quietly as I could. The figure was still there. I stepped outside. Their head turned. Not fast, slow, like they knew I was there the whole time. I didn't run. Not yet. I kept my pace steady, moving toward the road. Then they took a step. I ran. I didn't look back. My legs burned as I sprinted down the road, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop, not even when I felt something behind me, the air shifting like someone was reaching for me. I ran until my lungs ached, until my legs felt like they'd give out. Then headlights, a truck. I stumbled into the road, waving my arms. The driver slammed the brakes, barely stopping in time. I turned back. The figure was gone. The driver got out, cursing, asking what the hell I was doing in the middle of the road. I could barely speak. I just pointed back toward the gas station. He glanced over, then back at me. What? I looked again. Nothing. The gas station was dark and empty. No figure. No sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I saw. The driver gave me a ride to the next town. I filled up a gas can, got a ride back to my car. The whole way I kept looking behind us, watching the road, the trees. I never saw the figure again, but I felt them, and I still do. I had never liked driving at night, especially on back roads. The highway was one thing. Steady lanes, signs, the occasional truck stop if I needed to rest. But out in the countryside, it was different. Roads narrowed, shoulders disappeared, and the dark pressed in from every side. Headlights barely cut through it. Trees and open fields blurred past, and sometimes it felt like I wasn't moving forward at all, just stuck in one place while the world rushed past me. I should have planned my trip better, left in the morning, but things didn't work out that way. I had a long day at work, and by the time I got everything packed, it was already late afternoon. I had a 6-hour drive ahead of me to the hunting cabin, and I figured I'd at least make it most of the way before stopping for the night. I made good time on the highway, but as soon as I turned off onto the smaller county roads, my progress slowed. The GPS kept rerouting, leading me down unfamiliar roads, some of them barely paved. An hour passed, then another. My gas tank was getting low. I hadn't seen a town in a while, just long stretches of fields, barbed wire fences, the occasional barn. Some of the houses I passed looked abandoned, the paint peeling, roofs sagging under years of neglect. Others had porch lights glowing in the dark, but the yards were empty, and I saw no cars in the driveways. I checked the GPS again. It said I still had about 2 hours to go, but the road I was on didn't match what was on the screen. I slowed down, my high beams sweeping over a rusted road sign that barely had any readable letters left. I kept driving. 10 minutes later, I realized I was lost. There were no road signs anymore. No houses, no barns. Just endless black fields on both sides of the road. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds. My headlights were the only light for miles. I tried to pull up a map on my phone, but there was no signal. I didn't want to turn around yet. I figured I'd eventually hit another road or a town. But after another 20 minutes, I hadn't seen a single sign of life. I checked my gas gauge, less than a quarter tank. I needed to make a decision. Then I saw something up ahead. At first, I thought it was a mailbox, maybe a driveway, but as I got closer, I realized it was an old gas station. No lights, no signs, just a small squat building with 2 ancient-looking pumps out front. The windows were dark, and there was no car parked anywhere near it. I slowed down, debating whether to stop. It didn't look like it had been in business for years, but if there was a chance it had a working pump, I had to try. I pulled in, my tires crunching on gravel. I turned off the engine and stepped out. The air was colder than I expected, and the silence was thick, pressing in on me from all sides. I walked up to the pumps. The metal was rusted, the glass cracked. I lifted the nozzle. Nothing. I tried the other one. Same thing. I stepped back and looked at the building. The door was shut, but there was no lock. I hesitated. I didn't want to go in, but at the same time, I needed to know if there was anything useful inside. A phone, maybe a map, anything. I took a breath and pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. Dust, oil, something faintly rotten. The inside was as dark as the outside, and I had to use my phone's flashlight to see. The shelves were mostly empty, just a few old cans and bottles, all covered in dust. A wooden counter stretched along the back wall, a cash register sitting on top of it. I walked up and glanced behind it. Papers, an old coffee cup, a chair tipped over like someone had left in a hurry. There was a door in the back, slightly open. I didn't want to go any further. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw the first sign that something was really wrong. The dust on the floor was thick, undisturbed except for my own footprints. But near the door, where I had entered, there was a set of footprints leading inside. They weren't mine. The shape was different, the tread deeper. Someone had come in here before me, recently. I turned my light toward the far side of the room. The shelves cast long shadows, leaving dark spaces in between them, spaces someone could hide in. I backed toward the door. I didn't want to run. Running would make noise. Then I heard it, a soft creak. Not from behind the counter, not from outside, from the back room. I didn't wait. I turned and walked out, forcing myself not to sprint, not to slam the door behind me. I got back in my car, started the engine. My headlights flicked on, sweeping over the gas station, the empty lot. And then I saw him. A man stood at the edge of the building, just beyond the glow of my headlights. His clothes were dark, blending into the shadows, but I could see his face, pale and still. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at my car. I didn't stay to figure out what he wanted. I threw the car in reverse, backed out onto the road, and hit the gas. My hands were shaking on the wheel, my pulse hammering. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if he was still watching me. I drove for what felt like an hour before I saw a light up ahead. A real gas station, this time with a lit-up sign and a few cars parked outside. I pulled in, parked, and sat there for a long time, just breathing. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know how far I'd driven. But I knew one thing. I wasn't lost anymore. and I wasn't stopping at any more abandoned gas stations. It was supposed to be a simple drive, a straight shot through empty country roads, the kind that stretch for miles without a turn, without a landmark, without anything. I had done long drives before, but this one was different. It wasn't just the distance or the isolation, it was the feeling. The kind of feeling that settles deep in your stomach, heavy and cold, even when there's no reason for it. I had left town early that morning, just after sunrise. The plan was to drive straight through and be at my destination by nightfall. I had checked the route the night before, even downloaded an offline map just in case. There weren't many gas stations along the way, so I filled up the tank, packed extra water, and made sure my phone was fully charged. The road stretched out ahead of me, long and lonely, cutting through open plains and thick patches of forest. For the first few hours, everything went as expected. The sun climbed higher, heating up the air inside the car, and I rolled the windows down to let the wind cool me off. The road was empty, no cars in front of me, none behind. Just me, the road, and the occasional bird cutting across the sky. By midday, I had driven over 100 miles without seeing another soul. I passed a few rundown houses, the kind that look abandoned but aren't, with rusted-out trucks sitting in the yard and sheets covering the windows instead of curtains. No signs of life, no movement, just stillness. I told myself I was overthinking things. I had grown up in a small town. I knew what rural isolation looked like, but something about this stretch of road felt wrong. Maybe it was the lack of signs. No mile markers, no billboards, no speed limit signs. Just asphalt, cracked and fading in places, and endless fields stretching out on either side. Sometime in the afternoon, I saw the first vehicle I'd come across all day. A truck, old, faded red paint, dented on the sides, moving slow, too slow. I caught up to it easily, keeping my distance at first. Something about the way it moved didn't sit right with me. The truck wasn't swerving, but it wasn't steady either, like whoever was behind the wheel wasn't really paying attention. I debated passing it, but the road was narrow, and there were no shoulders, just ditches on either side, deep and lined with weeds. So I hung back, keeping a safe distance. Then the truck slowed down even more. I tapped my brakes, watching. It was like they wanted me to pass. A mile went by, another. Then the truck veered slightly, just enough to the right to give me room to overtake. I didn't want to. Everything in me said not to, but I couldn't stay behind them forever. I checked my mirrors, took a breath, and pressed down on the gas. My car surged forward, moving alongside the truck. And that's when I saw them. There were two people in the cab. The driver, an older man with deep wrinkles and a thick beard, stared straight ahead, expressionless. But the passenger, a younger man, maybe in his 30s, was looking right at me, and he was smiling. Not a friendly smile, not a normal one. It was too wide, too forced, like he was holding back laughter. I didn't look at him again. I just kept going, pushing the gas until I was past them, until they were shrinking in my mirror. I told myself I was overreacting, just some weird guy, that's all. But then I checked the mirror again, and the truck was speeding up. My stomach tightened. I kept my speed steady, watching. The truck got closer, not tailgating, but closer than before. I told myself it was nothing, just another driver on a long, empty road. But then they matched my speed. For miles, they stayed right behind me, close enough that I could see them in the mirror, but not so close that it looked intentional. Then the truck pulled out, moving into the other lane. They were trying to pass me. I felt it then, the real fear, the kind that makes your hands tighten on the wheel, your breath come shallow. I pressed the gas. So did they. We were side by side again, just like before. I didn't look this time. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands steady. Then the truck swerved. Just a little, just enough that I had to react. I jerked the wheel, my tires skidding slightly on the pavement, and then the truck slowed down again, falling back behind me. I drove faster than I should have, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be away from them. For a long time, they stayed behind me. Then, without warning, they turned off onto a dirt road. No signal, no hesitation, just gone. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I just kept driving. Hours passed. The sun dipped low, turning the sky orange and pink. I needed gas. I hadn't seen a station in over 100 miles. My gauge was dropping fast. I told myself I'd stop at the next one I saw. But when I did see one, I almost didn't pull in. It was old, run down, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't had a customer in years. But I didn't have a choice. I coasted up to the pump, my heart still racing from earlier. The place was empty. No other cars. No lights inside. Just a single old man sitting in a chair by the door, watching me. I got out, keeping my head down, my movements quick. As I pumped gas, I felt eyes on me. I glanced up. The old man was still watching. And then he said something. I couldn't hear him over the wind. I shook my head, signaling that I hadn't heard. He said it again. I still couldn't make it out. And then he pointed, back the way I had come. I looked, and there, in the distance on the side of the road, was the red truck. Parked, empty, watching. I didn't finish pumping. I didn't go inside. I got in my car, turned the key, and drove, faster than before. The truck never followed. But I never stopped again until I was miles away, in a town with real lights, real people, real life. I never took that road again, and I never forgot the way that man in the truck had smiled at me. It was already late when I left town, way later than I had planned. I had spent the day helping my buddy move some stuff into storage, and by the time I was done, my back was sore, and my clothes were damp with sweat. I should have just stayed the night at his place, but I wanted to get home. I had a 3-hour drive ahead of me, cutting through the back roads of a state I barely knew. I wasn't worried about getting lost. I had driven this way before, and my phone had enough signal to keep the GPS running. What worried me was the fact that my gas tank was barely above a quarter full, and I knew that once I left town, gas stations would be few and far between. I figured I had enough to make it at least 2/3 of the way, and then I'd have to stop at some no-name gas station on the side of the road. It wasn't ideal, but I wasn't about to waste another 40 minutes trying to find a gas station in town. By the time I got on the road, the sun was long gone, and the sky was a deep, inky black. The highway was quiet, almost unnervingly so. I passed the occasional car, their headlights sweeping past like ghosts, but for the most part, I was alone. I liked driving at night, but there was something about this stretch of road that felt different. Felt too quiet, too empty. About an hour into the drive, I saw the sign for my turnoff. It was an old state route, a 2-lane road that twisted through miles of forest and farmland. It wasn't the most direct route, but it shaved off enough time to make it worth it. I had taken it before, and while it wasn't exactly well maintained, it was good enough. I turned onto the road, my headlights cutting through the darkness. The trees pressed in on either side, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The only sound was the hum of my tires on the pavement and the occasional chirp of crickets. It was peaceful in a way, but it also felt isolating. I checked my fuel gauge, just under a quarter tank. Not great. I'd have to stop soon. About 30 minutes later, I saw a gas station up ahead. It wasn't much, just a small, rundown building with a single pump out front. The lights were on, but the place looked abandoned. The windows were dirty, and there was no sign of anyone inside. I pulled up to the pump and put the car in park. I got out, stretching my legs as I looked around. The air was cool, with a dampness that hinted at rain. I grabbed my wallet and walked toward the station's door. As I got closer, I saw the sign taped to the glass. Pay inside before pumping grate. I pushed open the door, and a small bell jingled somewhere in the back. The inside was as grimy as the outside. The shelves were half empty, stocked with dusty bags of chips and expired-looking candy bars. A small counter sat at the far end, with an old register and a glass case filled with cheap lighters and packs of cigarettes. No one was there. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding too loud in the empty store. No answer. I waited a moment, tapping my fingers against the counter. The place smelled like stale coffee and something faintly rotten. I checked my watch. I didn't have time for this. I was about to turn and leave when I heard something from the back, a rustling sound. I frowned. "Hey, you open?" Silence. I waited a few seconds, then shook my head. Screw this. I wasn't about to stand around all night waiting for some half-asleep cashier to wander out of the back room. I turned to leave. That's when I heard the door creak open behind me. I spun around, expecting to see a tired-looking clerk, maybe some old guy in a stained uniform shirt. But it wasn't a clerk. It was a man, tall, thin, wearing dark clothes. His face was partially hidden by the shadow of his hood, but I could see enough. His skin was pale, almost gray in the dim light, and his eyes, his eyes were dark and sunken, like he hadn't slept in weeks. He just stood there, blocking the door. Something about him set every nerve in my body on edge. Hey," I said, forcing a casual tone. "Do you work here?" He didn't answer. I took a step back, suddenly very aware of how alone I was. "I was just looking to get some gas," I said, my voice tight. No one was at the counter, so The man moved. Not much, just a small shift, a slight tilt of his head. But it was enough. I didn't wait. I turned and bolted for the side aisle, knocking over a rack of snacks as I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away from him. I heard footsteps behind me. Fast. I darted around a corner, nearly slipping on the dirty tile. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I needed to get out. I saw a door at the back of the store, a metal exit, probably leading to an alley or a loading area. I sprinted for it, grabbed the handle, and shoved it open. Darkness, a narrow alley, lined with trash bins and stacks of old pallets. I ran. The ground was uneven, cracked asphalt and patches of gravel. I stumbled, caught myself, kept moving. Then I heard it, the sound of the door creaking open behind me. I didn't look back. I just ran. There was a fence at the end of the alley, not too high but high enough. I scrambled up, my hands slipping on the damp metal. I hauled myself over and dropped down on the other side, landing hard on my knees. Pain shot up my legs, but I didn't stop. I ran toward the road. My car was still at the pump. The driver's side door was open. My stomach dropped. Had I left it open? Couldn't remember. I didn't have time to think about it. I sprinted across the lot, my eyes darting around for any sign of movement. Nothing. I reached the car, yanked open the door, and threw myself inside. I jammed the key into the ignition, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The engine roared to life. I slammed the door and locked it. My eyes flicked up to the rearview mirror. For a second, I thought I saw something, a shape, a shadow moving at the edge of the lot. But then I was peeling out onto the road, tires screeching against the pavement. I didn't stop driving. Didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main highway, surrounded by cars and streetlights and the comforting presence of other people. I never found out who that man was. Never went back to that gas station. But I think about it sometimes, about how close I was, about what would have happened if I hadn't run. had been driving for hours. The sun had set long ago, and the road stretched on endlessly, cutting through a landscape of rolling hills and dry fields. I wasn't in a hurry, but I had underestimated just how empty this stretch of road would be. No gas stations, no motels, no signs of life. Just darkness pressing in on both sides and the hum of my tires on the cracked pavement. It was late September, and the night air had a bite to it. I had my window cracked slightly, letting in the cool breeze, trying to keep myself alert. The only sound besides the engine was the occasional chirp of insects and the rustling of dry grass in the wind. My headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the road ahead, but beyond that, there was nothing. Just the night swallowing up everything in its path. I glanced at my gas gauge, less than a quarter of a tank. I had passed a sign a while back, but I couldn't remember what it said. There had to be a gas station somewhere up ahead. There had to be. The thought of running out of gas out here, in the middle of nowhere, was unsettling. I had no cell service, no real supplies beyond a half-empty water bottle and a few granola bars. I cursed myself for not filling up at the last town, but I had been so sure there'd be something along the way. I turned up the radio, trying to distract myself, but all I got was static. No stations, not even the faint whisper of a distant signal. I let out a slow breath and focused on the road. Then I saw something ahead. At first, it was just a dark shape in the distance. I squinted, trying to make it out. A car, maybe? No, it was too small for that. As I got closer, my headlights washed over it, and my stomach tightened. It was a person, a man, standing on the side of the road. He wasn't waving, wasn't signaling for help. He was just standing there, still as a statue, watching my car approach. I felt my pulse quicken. Something about him wasn't right. His posture was too stiff, too unnatural. He was wearing dark clothes, making it hard to make out any details, but I could see his face in the glow of my headlights. He was pale, his features sharp and sunken. I eased off the gas, my instincts screaming at me. I didn't want to stop. I didn't even want to slow down. I kept my foot steady, watching him as I approached. Just as I was about to pass him, he did something that made my blood run cold. He took a step toward the road. Not fast, not in a way that suggested he was trying to flag me down. Just a slow, deliberate step, like he was testing me, like he was seeing if I'd stop. I didn't. I kept driving, my hands tightening on the wheel. As I passed him, I risked one last glance in my rearview mirror. He was still standing there, but his head had turned, watching me as I drove away. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My heart was hammering against my ribs, and my palms were slick with sweat. I wiped them on my jeans and focused on the road. What the hell was he doing out here? There was nothing for miles. No houses, no towns. Just open land and this empty road. I shook my head, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe his car broke down. Maybe he was waiting for someone. But then why hadn't he waved me down? The thought gnawed at me as I kept driving. I glanced at the gas gauge again. The needle had dipped lower. I needed to find a gas station soon. Another 10 miles passed, then 20. No signs, no towns. Just the same endless road. Then I saw something ahead. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But no, there he was, the same man, standing on the side of the road. I slammed my foot on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. My headlights bathed him in light, and I could see him clearly now. Same dark clothes, same pale face. He had moved. There was no way he could have walked here. No way. I had been driving at least 60 miles per hour. But there he was, standing in the exact same pose, watching me. I didn't wait to figure it out. I floored the gas, my tires screeching against the pavement as I sped past him. My hands were shaking. My whole body was tense. This wasn't possible. I checked my mirror again. He was gone. I drove faster. The road stretched on, the darkness pressing in on all sides. Then, up ahead, something caught my eye. A sign. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Gas 5 miles. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles white. I just needed to make it 5 more miles. I forced myself to breathe, to focus. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see him again. Then, just as I was beginning to calm down, I saw something in the distance. A car. It was parked on the side of the road, its hazard lights flashing. I slowed down slightly, my heart still racing. As I got closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The driver's side door was open, and there was blood on the pavement. A lot of it. I didn't stop. Couldn't. I sped past, my whole body tense. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Then, just as I passed the car, I saw movement, a figure emerging from the shadows. The man. He stepped onto the road, his face just barely illuminated by my headlights. I pressed the gas pedal as hard as I could, my car roaring forward. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the gas station. When I finally pulled in, my hands were shaking. The station was small, run down, but it was open. A single flickering light buzzed above the pumps. I jumped out and hurried inside. The cashier, an older man with tired eyes, looked up as I entered. "You all right?" he asked. I hesitated. Then I shook my head. "Something weird out there," I muttered. He frowned. "Where you coming from?" I told him. His face changed. "You're lucky," he said quietly. "Few folks go missing out there." I stared at him. Then he pointed to the corner of the store, where a faded newspaper clipping was pinned to the wall. My stomach turned as I read the headline. "Missing man found dead near highway, body dumped in abandoned CR." The photo beneath it showed a familiar face. The man from the road. I was never the type of guy to overthink things. I trusted my instincts, made my choices, and stuck to them. But there was one night, one long, godforsaken night, where I questioned everything I ever believed about my ability to judge a situation. It started with a drive. I was heading through the back roads of Montana. It was late September, and I had taken a few days off work to clear my head. I wasn't dealing with anything heavy. No real drama. No breakups, no existential crises. I just wanted some time away from the routine. The plan was simple. I'd drive up from Missoula, cut through some of the national forest roads, and make my way toward a small town I'd read about online. A quiet place, not much more than a couple of diners and a gas station. Perfect for what I needed. I had packed everything I needed: extra gas, food, water, a blanket in case I needed to sleep in the truck. I wasn't an idiot. I knew how lonely these roads got, especially this time of year when tourist traffic had died down. The first few hours were uneventful. The road wound through the trees. The sky was an empty blue, and the only thing keeping me company was the hum of the truck's engine. The isolation felt good. It was the kind of quiet that didn't feel empty, just peaceful. Somewhere along the way, I got a little too confident in my route. The map on my phone had lost signal a while back, but I had a general sense of where I was going. The road signs were sparse, but I figured as long as I was heading north, I'd eventually get where I needed to be. Then I saw the turn. It was a narrow, barely paved road cutting through the trees. The kind of road that looked like it had been there forever but barely saw any use. There was an old wooden sign nailed to a post, but the paint had worn off long ago. I should have ignored it. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the part of me that liked a little adventure. Either way, I turned onto it, thinking it was a shortcut. First, it didn't seem so bad. The trees were thick, but the road itself was still passable. I drove another 20 minutes before I started to notice how wrong it felt. There was no real reason for it at first, just a feeling, a shift in the air. The sky, which had been clear all day, was turning gray. The trees looked darker, more tangled. And the road, it was narrowing, the pavement breaking apart, patches of dirt replacing what was left of the asphalt. Still, I kept going. It wasn't until I hit the first sign of trouble that I realized how alone I really was. A fallen tree blocked the road. Not a small one either. This thing had been ripped straight from the ground, roots and all. I could have turned around right then. I should have, but I was stubborn. I got out, checked it out, and decided I could drive around it. The ground looked solid enough. I was wrong. The second my tires hit the dirt, I felt it. The truck sank just a little at first, then more. I hit the gas, hoping to push through. The wheels spun, throwing up mud. The more I tried, the worse it got. I was stuck. I put it in park and sat there for a second, gripping the wheel. It was fine. I had a shovel in the back. I had time. I could dig myself out. I got out, stretched my legs, and took in my surroundings. That was when I noticed how quiet it had gotten. I mean, really quiet. No wind.
No birds.
No rustling in the trees. Just silence. Put me on edge, but I ignored it. I grabbed the shovel and started digging. The ground was softer than I expected, damp from the cold. Clung to the tires, thick and heavy. I kept at it, but I wasn't making much progress. Then I heard something, a crunch, like a footstep. I froze. It came from the trees, just beyond the road. I turned slowly, my breath stuck in my throat. Nothing, just trees stretching out in every direction. I told myself I was hearing things. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe it was a deer. I kept digging. Another crunch. Closer. I gripped the shovel, my palms sweating despite the cold air. I wasn't armed. My rifle was back in the truck. Stupid. I should have kept it on me. I turned again, scanning the trees. Still nothing. But the feeling, that awful, gut-deep feeling, was stronger now. I wasn't alone. I stood there, the shovel in my hands, my ears straining. The seconds stretched out, long and empty. Then I saw it. A shape, just barely visible between the trees. Tall, still, watching. My whole body locked up. I felt a rush of cold run through me, every hair on my arms standing on end. It didn't move. I didn't move. For what felt like forever, we just stood there. Then, slowly, it stepped back into the trees. Gone. I dropped the shovel and got in the truck. My hands were shaking as I locked the doors. My brain was scrambling for an explanation. A hiker? A hunter? Someone messing with me? I didn't know. I just knew I had to get out of there. I tried the engine again. It roared to life, but the tires spun uselessly in the mud. I didn't care. I kept trying, rocking the truck back and forth, anything to get traction. Then I heard it again. Closer. Something moving through the trees. Fast. I slammed the gas pedal, not even thinking anymore. The truck lurched, the back end sliding. For a second, I thought it was useless. Then, blessedly, the tires caught. The truck jolted forward, skidding onto the road. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just drove. The road was worse than I remembered. The trees seemed closer, the light dimmer. But I didn't care. I just needed to get out. I drove for what felt like hours. Maybe it was minutes. I don't know. Finally, the road opened up. I hit pavement. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main highway. Only then did I pull over. My hands were shaking, my heart still hammering in my chest. I sat there, breathing hard, staring at the road ahead. What the hell had I seen? Person? An animal? Something else? I don't know, and I don't want to know. All I know is I'll never take a shortcut again.